Vivian Hale pressed both hands over her mouth so no one inside that house would hear her cry. She was 23 years old, standing barefoot in the summer grass of a Virginia garden, and in 3 weeks she would be handed to a man who had already buried 2 wives. She had not chosen this. She had not agreed. But no one had asked her. If this story moves something in you, subscribe and follow it all the way to the end and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. The morning Vivian Hale understood that her family had already decided her fate, she was pouring tea. Not her own tea. She never drank tea in the morning anymore. Her hands trembled too much to hold the cup steady, and she could not afford to spill anything in Aunt Dorothea's house. Not the tea, not her composure, not a single word of what she actually felt. She poured slowly, carefully, the way she had learned to do everything in the 14 months since her father's business had collapsed and taken the last of the Hale name's dignity straight down with it. Vivien. Aunt Dorothea did not look up from her correspondence. The judge has sent another letter. Vivien set the teapot down. I know, Aunt. He is being extraordinarily patient. Patient. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Vivien watched the ripples move through her chest and said nothing. Judge Horace Whitlock was 61 years old. He had been married twice. His first wife had died of fever, or so it was said. His second wife had died of a fall down a staircase, or so it was said. In Hargrove County, Virginia, in the summer of 1812, what was said and what was true were often 2 entirely different countries, and no woman had ever been given a map to navigate between them. He is asking again about the date. Dorothea continued turning the letter over in her fingers as though it were a pleasant piece of social business. He would like the matter settled before September. The matter. Vivien pressed her fingertips flat against the lace tablecloth and kept her voice even. And what does Uncle Gerald say? Gerald says it is a generous arrangement. Dorothea finally looked up, and her expression was not unkind, which somehow made it worse. Vivien, the man, is offering to absorb the entirety of your father's outstanding debt to the Whitlock Land Trust. Do you understand what that means? Gerald's accounts are tied to those same notes. If Whitlock calls them in... I understand what it means, Vivien said quietly. Then you understand why we cannot. I understand what it means for the family, Vivien said, and this time she did not keep her voice quite so even. I am asking you to understand what it means for me. Silence settled between them like a third person at the table. Dorothea folded the letter. You will be well provided for. Vivien picked up the teapot again because it was something to hold. Yes, ma'am, she said. And she walked out of the breakfast room before her hands could start shaking where anyone could see them. Get your pie. The garden behind Whitlock Manor, the estate where Vivien had lived as a dependent guest for the past 14 months, was the only place that still felt like it belonged to something honest. The roses were hers in the way that things can belong to you without papers or permission. She had pruned them through the winter. She had tied them up when the spring storms came through. She had talked to them on the mornings when there was nothing else to say to anyone. She walked out there now in the full heat of the Virginia summer morning, and she did not care that the sun was already fierce at 8:30. The heat was easier than the dining room. The heat was honest. She knelt down beside the far hedgerow and pressed her forehead against the rough green leaves and let herself shake. She had not cried in 11 days. She had kept count. She was not going to cry now either. Except that she did. Not loudly. Vivian Hale had learned a long time ago that loud crying brought people running. And people running brought questions, and questions brought pity, and pity in Aunt Dorothea's house had a way of being transformed by some subtle social alchemy into obligation. So she cried the way she had learned to do most things in the past year, quietly, efficiently, with her face turned away from any window that might be watched. I cannot do this, she whispered to the hedge. I cannot walk into that house and become his wife. I cannot sit at his table. I cannot... She stopped, pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, breathed. I would rather walk out that front gate and take my chances on the road, she said very low to no one at all. I would rather die cold and hungry and free than spend one night under that man's roof." The summer air moved through the rose canes and said nothing back. She had no idea anyone was on the other side of the hedge. She had no idea that a man named Elias Worthington had arrived at Whitlock Manor 40 minutes earlier for a meeting about federal land investment transfers. She had no idea that he had stepped away from the house to clear his head before the meeting began. She had no idea that he had stopped walking the moment he heard her voice. And she had absolutely no idea that he was still standing there, listening to every word. Dialogue. Elias Worthington was not a man who stopped for things. He was 32 years old, and he had built that reputation deliberately, the way a man builds a stone wall, one deliberate placement at a time. No gaps, no sentiment. He was a federal land investment advisor, which was a polite way of saying that he moved money and influence through the new American Republic. The way rivers move water through a landscape, quietly, powerfully, and always toward somewhere particular. He had negotiated war contracts during the early conflicts with Britain. He had brokered land agreements between state magistrates who hated each other so thoroughly they could not be in the same room. He had done all of this while remaining almost entirely unmoved by human drama, which was considered one of his greatest professional assets. He had also, at the age of 26, watched a woman he intended to marry be handed to another man by her father for reasons of business convenience. He had not interfered. He had considered that restraint to be the correct decision for approximately 6 years. He was reconsidering it now. He stood on the opposite side of the garden hedge, one hand resting against the wooden post at the end of the row, and he listened to a voice that cracked with the particular kind of pain that comes from trying very hard not to make a sound while something inside you breaks. He had not intended to eavesdrop. He had walked out to the garden because Gerald Hale's cousin, some visiting relative from North Carolina, had started pontificating about cotton prices inside the manor, and Elias had found his patience for that particular conversation already used up before it began. He should have kept walking. He should have gone around the other side of the garden, back to the house, into the meeting, done his business, and left. Instead, he stood very still and heard a 23-year-old woman tell a hedge that she would rather die on an open road than be handed over to Horace Whitlock. And something shifted in Elias Worthington's chest that had not shifted in a very long time. He did not move until her footsteps retreated back toward the house. Then he straightened his coat, reset his expression to something businesslike and unremarkable, and walked back through the garden gate toward the meeting he had originally come for. But his mind was no longer on land transfers. The meeting with Judge Whitlock lasted 2 hours. Elias sat across from the man and watched him with the careful evaluating attention that he normally reserved for contracts he suspected of containing hidden clauses. Whitlock was broad and self-assured in the way that men become when no one has said no to them in many years. His voice carried the particular weight of a man who had learned that speaking slowly made other men feel that what he was saying must be important. He poured bourbon at 11 in the morning and offered Elias a glass with the manner of someone conferring a favor. Elias declined. "You're here about the Pendleton Creek parcels," Whitlock said, spreading a map across the table. "Among other matters," Elias said, "the Federal Trust is interested in the eastern boundary." "The Federal Trust is interested in a number of things in Hargrove County." Whitlock smiled. It was a smile that had probably charmed a great many people in rooms like this one. "I imagine they are. This county will be the crossroads of the new republic within a generation, Mr. Worthington. The man who holds these land notes will hold considerable influence." "And who currently holds the notes against the Hale family accounts?" Elias asked. It was a casual question. He delivered it the way you might ask about the weather. Whitlock's smile did not change, but his eyes did a small, almost imperceptible recalibration. "That's a specific inquiry. I'm a specific man." "The Hale debt is a private arrangement," Whitlock said. "It has been settled through certain family agreements." "The kind involving Miss Vivian Hale," Elias said. A pause. "The family has made its arrangements," Whitlock said, and his voice had dropped half a register, pleasant still, but with something beneath it that was not pleasant at all. The young lady is to be married. It is a matter of mutual benefit." "Mutual," Elias repeated. "She will be well provided for." The second time in one morning that he had heard a woman's life reduced to that particular phrase. He found it no more convincing the second time. "What is the total outstanding debt?" Elias asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "That is not a matter for this meeting." "No," Elias agreed. "It is a matter for a different meeting entirely." He picked up his hat, thanked Judge Whitlock for his time, and left. He made 3 inquiries before sunset. The first was to Gerald Hale's solicitor, a nervous little man named Fenwick, who operated out of a small office above the dry goods store in town, and who became significantly more forthcoming when Elias placed a modest but unmistakable indication of federal interest on his desk. The Hale debt was substantial. Not catastrophic, not the kind of sum that would ruin an entire county, but substantial enough that a family of Gerald Hale's modest position, having absorbed his brother-in-law's failed Boston merchant accounts, could not service it without significant distress. Whitlock held the notes, had held them for 8 months, had been, according to Fenwick's careful and slightly sweating account, extremely patient about the matter. Patient. There was that word again. "And the arrangement with Miss Hale," Elias said. "Was it her idea?" Fenwick looked at his desk. "The family determined—" "Was it her idea?" Elias repeated. Fenwick did not answer, which was its own kind of answer. The second inquiry was to a man named Calloway, who dealt in county records and land registry documents, and who owed Elias a professional courtesy from a matter 2 years prior involving a disputed boundary line. From Calloway, Elias obtained confirmation of what the 2 previous wives of Judge Horace Whitlock had died of, and the approximate timeline of each event, and the name of the physician who had signed the death certificates in both cases. The physician, it turned out, was Whitlock's personal doctor and a man who owed the judge a considerable amount of money. Elias sat with that information for a long time in the evening heat. The third inquiry was to his own financial associate in Richmond, a man named Price, who had access to the kind of liquidity that could move quickly and quietly when Elias determined that quick and quiet movement was required. "I need a number," Elias said. "What kind of number?" "The kind that makes a debt disappear." That evening, Vivien sat on the low stone wall at the edge of the garden and watched the fireflies come out over the Virginia fields. She had been summoned to the parlor at 4 o'clock to take tea with Dorothea and 2 of the aunt's friends, and she had sat through an hour and a half of discussion about lace patterns and the upcoming harvest social, and whether the Millbrook family's second daughter had been appropriately modest at last month's assembly. And she had said the right things at the right moments, and smiled when smiled at, and then she had excused herself and come back to the garden because she could not breathe inside that house. 3 weeks. She kept coming back to that. 3 weeks before September, before Whitlock, before the door she could see coming closed on her life. She was not a foolish woman. She knew what her options were, and she had thought about them with a cold, clear honesty that she could not afford to let anyone see. She could refuse, and her refusal would collapse Gerald's accounts and put her aunt and uncle in genuine financial ruin, and she would have to live with that, assuming anyone let her live in this house afterward, which they would not. She could run. She had perhaps $40 hidden in the lining of a boot, and she knew no one in Virginia outside of Aunt Dorothea's social circle, and a woman alone on the road in 1812 with $40 and no name worth speaking was not running to freedom. She was running to a different kind of trap. She could appeal to the law, and here she nearly laughed out loud into the summer dark, because the law in Hargrove County was administered by men who had dinner with Horace Whitlock on a regular basis. Or she could do what she had been doing. Hold still, keep her hands steady, pour the tea without spilling, and wait for something she did not actually believe was coming. The fireflies blinked in the dark field. She watched them and said nothing. The next morning she was in the garden again at 7:30 when she heard the creak of the front gate. She did not look up. Visitors arrived at the front of the house, not the garden side. It was probably a delivery. Then she heard boots on the gravel path, not the shuffling walk of a delivery boy, but the deliberate, unhurried stride of a man who knew exactly where he was going. She stood up. He came around the end of the hedgerow, the same hedge she had wept behind the morning before, and he stopped when he saw her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He was tall. Dark coat, no ornamentation, the kind of clothes that said money without trying to. His face was not unkind, but it was careful, the face of a man who had learned to keep things off it. Vivien had never seen him before in her life. "Miss Hale," he said. She did not reach for a smile. She was too tired for that. "You have the advantage of me, sir. My name is Elias Worthington. I'm here to speak with your uncle. My uncle takes his correspondence in the study at this hour." "I know." He did not move toward the house. He stayed where he was at the end of the hedgerow and looked at her with a directness that was not rude, just honest. "I wanted to speak with you first." Something cold moved through her. "About what?" "About whether there is anything you would like me to know," he said, "before I go inside and make an arrangement that affects your life." The summer air was already thick and warm. A cardinal called somewhere in the rose canes. Vivien looked at this man she had never met and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, the sensation of being looked at, actually looked at, as though what she thought might matter to someone. She was careful with it. She had learned to be careful with things that seemed like hope. "I don't know what arrangement you mean," she said. "Yes, you do," he said quietly. She studied him. "Who are you?" "Mr. Worthington." "Why would a federal landman concern himself with the domestic accounts of a family like mine?" "That," he said, "is a reasonable question." "Then answer it." He looked at her steadily. "Because I heard you in the garden yesterday morning, behind that hedge." The blood left her face. She did not move, did not look away. But something in her chest went very still, the way a bird goes still when it realizes it is no longer alone. "Every word," she managed. "Every word," he said. Silence stretched between them in the summer heat. "Then you know I am not willing," she said, and her voice was perfectly level, because she had decided in the span of a single breath that she would not be ashamed of what he had heard. She had meant every word of it. She still meant it. "You know this is not my choice." "I know that," he said. "And you've come to do what exactly? Confirm the transaction. Witness it. Advise my uncle on the most efficient means of—" "No." His voice was quiet, but absolute. "I've come to make it stop." Vivien stared at him. The cardinal called again in the roses. "You can't do that," she said. "The debt has been purchased," he said, "as of this morning. The Whitlock notes against your uncle's accounts are now held by a federal land trust account under my administration. Judge Whitlock no longer has any financial claim over this family." She could not speak. "The engagement," he continued, "has no legal or financial foundation anymore. It can be dissolved." "He won't accept that," she said, and her voice had a thin, frightened edge to it now that she could not quite control. "He has connections. He has the county magistrate. He has a number of men who owe him favors," Elias said calmly. "I have the federal government of the United States of America. It is a somewhat larger organization." She looked at him for a long time. Something was building in her chest, something large and frightening and completely unfamiliar. Not gratitude, not yet. Something more complicated than that. The feeling of a door opening in a wall you had stopped believing had any doors in it at all. "Why?" she asked. Her voice came out very small. He was quiet for a moment. "Because you said you would rather die free than live without a choice," he said. "And I have had occasion to regret for a long time the moment when I could have done something similar for someone and chose not to." She did not ask him to explain that. Not then. She stood in the summer garden of a house that had never been hers in a situation she had not made, and she looked at a man she did not know, and she took one slow breath and then another. "My uncle," she said finally, "is going to be furious." "Yes," Elias agreed. "And Judge Whitlock will not take this quietly." "No," Elias agreed again. He will not. This will cause significant difficulty. I expect it will cause a great deal of difficulty. She held his gaze. And you are prepared for that. He looked back at her with that careful, honest face and said, Miss Hale, I have been dealing with difficult men in difficult rooms for a long time. I am considerably more prepared for this than you might think. Something moved across her face then, not quite a smile. Too complicated for a smile. But something. Then I suppose, she said quietly, that you had better go speak to my uncle. He nodded once, settled his hat, and turned toward the house. He had gone 6 steps when she said, Mr. Worthington. He stopped. Thank you, she said. Not for saving me. She held his eyes across the garden. For asking me first. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very simply, You're welcome, ma'am. And he walked toward the house, and the summer roses stood in the heat around Vivian Hale. And for the first time in 3 weeks, she let herself breathe all the way down to the bottom of her lungs. She did not know what came next. She did not know if it would work. She did not know this man, or his reasons, or the full weight of what was about to come down on this house like a summer storm. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. For the first time in 14 months, someone had walked through that gate and looked at her, not at her family's debt, not at her uncle's accounts, not at the arrangements that had been made in rooms she had not been invited into, but at her, and asked what she wanted. And that in 1812, Virginia was so rare a thing that Vivian Hale pressed her hand over her heart and held it there for a long moment in the summer heat, and did not let herself cry. Not because she was hiding it this time, but because for the first time in a very long time, she did not need to. Elias Worthington walked into Gerald Hale's study without knocking, not because he was rude, because he had learned over 12 years of federal negotiation that men like Gerald Hale responded better to certainty than to courtesy. A man who knocked was a man who was asking permission. A man who walked in had already decided the meeting was happening. Gerald was at his desk, papers spread in front of him, reading glasses perched at the end of his nose. He looked up with the startled expression of someone who had not expected to be interrupted and had not yet decided whether to be offended by it. Mr. Worthington. He reached for the offense. I believe my butler was meant to announce you. Your butler is downstairs explaining to your housekeeper why the morning milk delivery was short a half pint, Elias said, pulling the chair in front of the desk out and sitting down without being invited to. I didn't want to interrupt that. Gerald blinked. Then he took his glasses off slowly, in the manner of a man who was deciding whether this was a social call or something more consequential. To what do I owe the unexpected pleasure? I've purchased the Whitlock notes, Elias said. The glasses stopped moving in Gerald's hand. I beg your pardon. The outstanding debt on your accounts. The notes that Judge Whitlock held against your family going back to the collapse of your brother-in-law's Boston interests. As of this morning, those notes have been transferred to a federal land trust under my administration. Elias put a single folded document on the desk. That's the transfer confirmation. You'll want your solicitor to look at it, but you'll find it's entirely in order. Gerald picked up the document with the careful fingers of a man handling something he didn't yet understand. He opened it. He read it. He read it again. This is... He stopped, started again. This is irregular. It's perfectly legal. I understand it's legal, I'm asking why. Gerald looked up and his expression had shifted. Now the social confusion burning off something sharper underneath. You don't have any connection to these accounts. This is a private family matter. Why would a federal investment man purchase a private debt arrangement? Because federal investment men encounter all kinds of financial instruments in the course of their work, Elias said evenly, and sometimes they see an opportunity. What opportunity? Gerald's voice had developed an edge. These notes aren't particularly profitable. They're family debt, not a land asset. There's nothing in this for you unless... He stopped. His eyes narrowed. You spoke to Vivien. I encountered Miss Hale in the garden this morning. What did she say to you? She asked my name, Elias said. And I told her. Gerald stood up. He was not a tall man, but he used height when he had it, and he drew himself up now with the full force of a man who had spent 20 years being the authority in his own house. "Mr. Worthington, I don't know what my niece may have said or implied about the arrangements this family has made, but those arrangements are a private matter, and they are entirely appropriate, and I will not have an outside party walking into my home and interfering with the engagement to Judge Whitlock," Elias said, "will be dissolved." The room went very quiet. Gerald's mouth was still open from the last word he'd been about to say. He closed it, opened it again. "I'm sorry. The engagement, the arrangement, whatever you're calling it in conversation, it will be dissolved. The financial obligation that created it no longer exists. There's nothing to support it." Elias let that sit for a moment, and then added very quietly, "And I think, Mr. Hale, if you are honest with yourself in the privacy of this room, you know that your niece did not agree to it willingly. And you know what kind of man Horace Whitlock is." Gerald's face went through several things in rapid succession: indignation, discomfort, and then something that looked very much like shame before he drove it back under the surface where respectable men kept their shame in 1812 Virginia. "Vivien will be well provided for," he said, but his voice had lost a significant portion of its authority. "She told me," Elias said, standing, "that she would rather die on the open road than enter that marriage." He picked up his hat from the arm of the chair. "I believed her. I suspect you do too." He walked to the door. "Worthington." Gerald's voice came out strained. "Whitlock will not accept this. He has connections throughout this county. He has the ear of the state magistrate. If he decides to make this unpleasant, then it will be unpleasant," Elias said without turning around. "But it will also be finished. Good morning, Mr. Hale." He walked out. Behind him in the study, Gerald Hale sat back down in his chair very slowly, like a man whose legs had decided they were done, pretending everything was fine. Vivien found out what had happened at 11 o'clock when Aunt Dorothea came into the garden with her hands clasped in front of her, and her expression the careful, complicated mixture of a woman who was both relieved and terrified, and did not want to be seen as either. "Your uncle has had a conversation with Mr. Worthington," she said. Vivien kept her hands in the rose canes. "I know. The debt arrangement with Judge Whitlock." Dorothea stopped. "Do you know what Worthington has done?" "He told me this morning." Dorothea stared at her. "He told you? Before he spoke to Gerald?" "Yes." "Why on earth would he—" She stopped again. She was a woman who prided herself on understanding social situations, and this one was not behaving correctly. "Vivien, do you know this man? Have you had previous correspondence with him? Has there been some—" "I met him this morning," Vivien said. "For the first time." "Then why would a federal land investor purchase your uncle's debt on the basis of one morning's—" Dorothea stopped a third time, and Vivien could see the moment when her aunt's social intelligence assembled the available pieces and arrived at something close to the truth. Her expression shifted into something more complicated. "What did he hear?" Vivien looked at her steadily. Whatever he heard, Aunt, it was the truth. The silence between them was different from the silence at breakfast. This one had things in it. Old things. Dorothea reached out and touched Vivien's arm quickly, briefly, like someone touching a stove to test its heat. "Gerald is going to handle this very carefully. We can't afford to anger Whitlock directly, you understand. The man has—" "I know what the man has," Vivien said. "Friends in positions that could make things very difficult for this family." "I know." Dorothea's hand tightened briefly on her arm, then released. "I want you to know," she said very quietly, "that if I had thought there was another way—" "There was always another way," Vivien said, and her voice was gentle because she did not hate her aunt. Dorothea was not a cruel woman. She was a frightened woman, operating inside a system that had been designed by people who were not frightened at all, and those were sometimes the most dangerous kind of person to be controlled by. But it would have cost you something, and you weren't willing to pay it. Dorothea looked at her for a long moment with something in her eyes that Vivien couldn't quite name. Then she said, "Be careful with this man, Vivien," and walked back toward the house. Vivien turned back to the roses and tried to understand what her hands were doing, because they were shaking again. Not with fear this time, but with something she had even less practice managing. Judge Horace Whitlock arrived at Whitlock Manor at 2 o'clock that afternoon. He had not been invited. He did not require invitations to his own county. He was riding with 2 of his men, not servants, but the particular kind of large, quiet men that powerful men in 1812 Virginia kept nearby to underscore the naturalness of their authority. He came to the front door of the manor, which was his family's estate, that Gerald Hale's household was currently occupying, under a rental arrangement, which meant he could arrive when he pleased, and Gerald could smile and open the door and offer him whatever he asked for, because refusing the man whose name was on the deed was not a situation Gerald's nerves were currently equipped for. Vivien was not in the house when Whitlock arrived. She was told afterward by the housekeeper, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Cobb, who had been with the manor longer than the current occupants, and who had her own opinions about Judge Whitlock, that the conversation in Gerald's study had lasted 45 minutes and had involved raised voices, which was exceptional because Gerald Hale did not raise his voice, and Whitlock almost never needed to. She was told that Elias Worthington had been present for part of it. She was told that at one point Whitlock had struck the desk with the flat of his hand hard enough to upset the inkwell. She was told that when it ended, Whitlock had walked out of the study and through the front hall and out the door without saying another word to anyone in the house, and his 2 quiet men had followed him, and his horse had left divots in the gravel at the front of the drive that were still visible in the late afternoon heat. What she was not told, not by Mrs. Cobb, not by anyone, was what had actually been said in that room. She found out at 4 o'clock. Elias found her in the garden, which had apparently become the place where consequential conversations happened in this house, and he sat down on the low stone wall uninvited and looked at her with the expression of a man who was about to say something he was not entirely sure how she would receive. "The engagement has been dissolved," he said. Vivien let out a breath. Formally enough. Your uncle has accepted the debt transfer and withdrawn from the Whitlock arrangement. It'll be known in the county by tomorrow morning." "And Whitlock?" "Whitlock," Elias said, "is angry." "How angry?" "The kind of angry that doesn't show. That's the kind to watch." He looked at her directly. "He's not going to take legal action. There's no legal ground the notes were transferred clean. But he has influence, and influence doesn't need ground to operate on. There will be social consequences for your family. Doors that were open, maybe less so." "There weren't very many open doors to begin with," Vivien said. "No, I suppose not." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to be clear with you about something, Miss Hale. I have done what I could do, and it is done. I don't intend to insert myself further into your family's situation unless you want me to. This was..." He paused, chose his words carefully. "This was a thing I was able to do. I did it. What happens from here is yours to determine." She looked at him. "You purchased a significant federal debt on my behalf and confronted one of the most powerful men in Hargrove County, all in one morning." "Yes. And now you're telling me you don't intend to insert yourself." "That's correct. Mr. Worthington." She tilted her head slightly. "Most men who do something significant for a woman expect something in return." He met her eyes. "I'm aware of how it looks. I want to be clear that I have no claim on you, no expectation. What I did because it was the right thing to do, and because..." He stopped again. "Because I should have done something like it once before, and I didn't. This is not a transaction." The summer heat pressed down on both of them, and the fireflies were not out yet, and the roses were very still in the breathless afternoon. "What did you fail to do?" she asked quietly. "Before." He looked at the rose canes for a moment. "There was a woman, 6 years ago, similar circumstances. I knew what was being done, and I told myself it was not my place, and I kept my distance. And she married a man who made her life..." He paused. "Small. Is she still?" "She's alive," he said. "She's unhappy. And I have had 6 years to understand that keeping my distance was not neutrality. It was a choice. And it was the wrong one." Vivien was quiet for a long time. "You came to this county for a land meeting," she said finally. "I did." "And you happened to walk into this garden?" "I did." "And you heard me behind the hedge?" "Yes." She looked at him with the measured attention of a woman who had learned to read people carefully because her situation had never permitted her the luxury of reading them casually. "Do you believe in Providence, Mr. Worthington?" Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. "I believe in paying attention," he said. "Whether that is providence or just good habit, I have never been able to determine." A sound came from inside the house, the particular slam of a door that meant Gerald had returned to his study, with his temper still fully operational. Both of them registered it, and neither of them moved. "My uncle is going to want to talk to me this evening," Vivien said. "I expect so." "He is going to be complicated about this." "Yes." "He will feel that the resolution of his debt obligation should produce some gratitude on my part, and that gratitude should produce cooperation." "Most likely." "And you want me to know that if cooperation means accepting some other arrangement he has in mind, it means nothing of the kind," Elias said, and his voice was still quiet, but there was something in it that had not been there before, a particular firmness like a boot set into the ground. "The debt is gone. There is nothing left for an arrangement to be based on. If Gerald Hale attempts to create a new one, he will find that the financial structure of his accounts is now under a federal administrative eye that will make such attempts considerably more complicated than they were before." Vivien stared at him. "Did you do that on purpose?" "I made certain calls this morning," he said. "Yes." "You set up a situation where my uncle can't easily manipulate the accounts to create a new leverage point." "I created a situation where the accounts are being administered appropriately and in accordance with federal guidelines," he said with precisely the tone of a man reciting an entirely accurate description of a thing that also happened to serve another purpose entirely. A sound came from Vivien's chest that was entirely unexpected, not quite a laugh, but the shape of one. She pressed her hand over her mouth quickly. "Mr. Worthington." "Miss Hale. That is either the most calculating act of generosity I have ever encountered," she said, "or the most generous act of calculation." "I have been told," he said, and there was definitely something in his expression now, something quiet and warm that he was making no particular effort to suppress, that the line between the two is thinner than most people like to admit. She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon was heavy and gold around them, and inside the house, Gerald's study was probably becoming progressively less comfortable to be near. And somewhere in the county, Horace Whitlock was sitting with his anger and his influence and his particular talent for making things difficult, and none of that had changed. The world was still the world. The year was still 1812. But something had shifted on its axis somewhere between this morning's hedge and this afternoon's stone wall, and Vivian Hale was intelligent enough to recognize when the ground under her feet had changed, even if she could not yet see where the new ground went. "I should go inside," she said. "Yes." She stood, smoothed her dress, looked at him one more time. "Will you still be in the county tomorrow?" she asked. He looked up at her. "I had planned to leave by noon." "Had planned," she said. "Plans," he said after a moment, "change." She held his gaze for one breath, then two. "Good evening, Mr. Worthington," she said. "Good evening, Miss Hale." She walked back toward the house, and she did not look back, because she had learned that looking back was a habit that got women killed, or kept, or handed over, and she was trying consciously and deliberately to practice the newer habit of looking forward. But she was aware every step that he was still sitting on the stone wall, and she was aware that he watched her go. The conversation with Gerald that evening was everything she had expected it to be, and one thing she had not. He called her to the study at 7. He was behind his desk, the desk that Elias had sat in front of that morning a lifetime ago, and his expression was the expression of a man who had been outmaneuvered and was not prepared to admit it directly. "You spoke to Worthington before he came to me," Gerald said. "He spoke to me," Vivien said. I didn't seek him out. Nevertheless, you knew what he intended. He told me what he had done, yes. Gerald pressed his fingertips together on the desk and looked at her with the expression of a man attempting patience. Vivien, what happened today is it's irregular. Worthington has put himself in the middle of private family business for reasons I do not entirely understand. And while the debt issue is... He paused. While that particular pressure is eased, the situation with Whitlock is now considerably more delicate. The man is not going to simply accept, "I'm not marrying him," Vivien said. Gerald blinked. He had not expected the direct form. Vivien, I am not going to marry Horace Whitlock. That has not changed. What has changed is that you no longer have a financial instrument with which to compel me. So what we are deciding now is not whether I marry him. We are deciding what happens next. Gerald was quiet for a moment. In 23 years of knowing her, Vivien reflected she had never spoken to him in quite this tone. It was possible she had never had the ground beneath her stable enough to stand on while using it. What happens next, Gerald said slowly, is that this family navigates a very complicated social situation. Whitlock has influence. He has friends. He will not simply go away quietly. I know that. He will make things difficult. I know that too. And Worthington. Gerald paused. What is Worthington to you, Vivien, genuinely? What has this man said to you? She looked at her uncle with the clear, honest gaze of a woman who had spent a long time being careful and was deciding now to be something else. He told me I owe him nothing. He told me I have no obligation to him and no debt to repay. He told me that what he did was a thing he believed was right, and that what I do with my life from here forward is entirely my own determination. Gerald looked at her. And you believe him? I believe, she said, that he has given me no evidence yet to disbelieve. Yet, Gerald said. Yet, she agreed. Because she was not a naive woman, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. Gerald picked up the transfer document from the corner of his desk. Elias's document still sitting where it had been placed that morning, and turned it over in his hands. Then he set it down. He's staying in the county tomorrow. Did you know that? He mentioned his plans had changed. Gerald studied her. This is very unusual. Yes. You understand that if there is any appearance of an improper arrangement between you and this man, Whitlock will use it. He will use it extremely efficiently. I understand that. Then you'll be careful, Uncle Gerald. She stood up. I have been careful for 14 months. I have been so careful that no one in this house could see me anymore. I was careful into a corner, and the corner was Horace Whitlock's doorstep. She picked up the edge of her skirt, the way women do when they're done with a conversation. I will be intelligent. I will be circumspect. I will conduct myself with complete propriety. But I am finished with the kind of careful that means disappearing. She walked to the door. Vivien, Gerald said quietly. She stopped. I am sorry, he said, for how this was handled, before. She stood in the doorway for a moment. The apology was small. It was insufficient. It was also genuine, which was something she had not expected from him, and she found it was more difficult to hold on to her composure in the face of his genuine regret than it would have been to hold on to it in the face of his defensiveness. I know, she said, and she walked out. The next morning came in loud. Not with voices with a letter. It arrived before breakfast before 7, delivered by a rider who didn't stay for a response, and who wore no livery that anyone in the house recognized. Mrs. Cobb brought it to Vivien's room because it was addressed to Miss Hale and not to Gerald, which was irregular enough that the housekeeper had decided it warranted delivering directly. The letter was not signed. It said in a clean, controlled hand, "You have made enemies you do not understand. The man who has interfered in your family's affairs is not what he appears to be. Ask him about the land surveys in Pendleton Creek. Ask him why a federal investment man came to Hargrove County 2 days before your engagement date. Ask him what he stands to gain when the Whitlock Trust is restructured. Then decide what you believe." Vivien read it 3 times. She folded it carefully and placed it on her dressing table and sat down in the chair beside the window and looked at it. Her first reaction was, it was from Whitlock. Obviously. Planted to create suspicion. The man had lost a social battle yesterday, and he was attempting to start a different kind of one. Her second reaction was, she was not wrong about that in all probability. And none of that meant the questions themselves weren't worth asking. She picked up the letter and went to find Elias Worthington. He was in the small parlor that Gerald had designated for his use during his extended stay, working through correspondence with the focused attention of a man who had learned to conduct multiple operations simultaneously. He looked up when she came in. He took in her expression. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. He read faces the way she read roses by the particular tension of the thing in front of him. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. His face did not change significantly while he read, which was itself a kind of information. When he finished, he folded it the way she had folded it down the same creases and placed it on the correspondence pile beside him and looked at her. "This is from Whitlock," he said. "Most likely." "You don't seem entirely certain." "I'm certain of most things, and cautious about the rest," she said. "What are the Pendleton Creek land surveys?" He was quiet for a moment. Not a long moment, not the kind of pause that meant evasion. The kind that meant he was deciding how much to say and in what order. "Pendleton Creek is a parcel of federal land in the south of this county," he said. "The survey question involves whether it falls within the boundary of the Whitlock Family Trust or within federal jurisdiction. If it's federal, the trust loses a significant income stream. If it's trust land, the federal navigation project that's been proposed for the creek has to be abandoned or rerouted at significant cost." "And you were here to determine which," Vivien said. "I was here to review the survey documents, yes." "Which would benefit the federal side. Which would produce an accurate determination," he said evenly. "Which happens to also benefit the federal side, yes. So you had a professional reason to be in conflict with Whitlock before you ever heard me in that garden." "Yes." She held his gaze. "Does that change what you did?" He met her eyes and did not look away. "Does it change it for you?" That was the question, wasn't it? She had asked herself the same thing walking down the hallway. A man with a pre-existing reason to want Whitlock weakened suddenly intervenes to weaken Whitlock on her behalf. The generosity and the calculation overlap perfectly. How do you see clearly through that? "It might change your motivation," she said slowly. "It doesn't change the fact that I am not going to marry Horace Whitlock." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't change that. And it doesn't change the fact that you told me I owe you nothing." "That is still true." "But I want to know," she said, "because I would rather know the complicated truth than a comfortable version of it. Did you intervene for me or against him?" The summer morning was already pressing heat through the parlor windows. Somewhere outside, a mockingbird was being extremely vocal about something. Elias Worthington looked at Vivian Hale across the small parlor table with the expression of a man who was, she thought, quite genuinely tired of performing simplicity for people. "Both," he said. "I heard you behind that hedge, and I could not walk away. That is the truth. And I also have a professional stake in weakening Whitlock's position in this county. That is also the truth. And both of those things were present in the same room when I made my decisions yesterday. I cannot separate them cleanly for you. I don't think it would be honest to try." She breathed, steady, deliberate. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "That's all." "What were you expecting?" "Most people," he said carefully, "when they receive a complicated answer to a question, they want it to be simple, become upset. I'm not most people," she said. "And I've been living in a house full of people who gave me simple answers to complicated questions for 14 months. The complications were still there. They were just hidden." She reached over and picked up the letter from his correspondence pile. "Whitlock sent this to make me distrust you. He sent it because it contains enough truth to be useful. I prefer to know the truth and make my own decisions with it." She folded the letter and put it in her pocket. "So," she said, "the survey. What do you need to complete it?" He stared at her. "The Pendleton Creek survey," she said. "What do you need?" "I need access to the original boundary documents," he said slowly. "They're held in the county registry. Whitlock's family trust has disputed access to those records for 2 years on the grounds that the registry clerk is a federal appointment. Which he is, but that's not actually a legitimate ground for—" "The registry clerk is Fenwick," Vivien said. Elias stopped. "Fenwick," she said, "has dinner every Thursday evening with a woman named Adelaide Marsh, who is the second cousin of Mrs. Cobb, who has been running this household for 19 years, and who has very strong opinions about Judge Horace Whitlock, and almost no opinions at all about federal land administration." She looked at him. "Mrs. Cobb's opinions about Whitlock are based on things she has observed in this house over 19 years, that I expect you would find professionally interesting if she were willing to discuss them." Elias was entirely still. "She won't discuss them with a man she doesn't know," Vivien said. "She might discuss them with me. And Adelaide Marsh might have a word with Fenwick about the registry access question if someone she trusted asked her to." "Miss Hale." His voice was very careful. "Are you offering to help me?" "I'm offering," she said, "to stop being the subject of other people's arrangements and to start being useful in my own right." She looked at him with a directness that she had kept hidden for 14 months and was now done hiding. "You said I owe you nothing. I believe you. This isn't debt. This is—" She paused. "I live in this county. I know the people in it. I know which conversations happen in which parlors and over which dinner tables. That is information you don't have, and I do. And Whitlock is a threat to both of us now. That seems like sufficient ground for a practical alliance." The mockingbird outside continued to hold its vigorous opinions about the morning. Elias Worthington looked at the woman across the table from him. This woman who had been crying behind a hedge 24 hours ago, and who was now proposing a strategic partnership with the focused attention of someone who had simply been waiting for the moment when strategy was permitted to her, and he said quite quietly, "I believe you may be more dangerous than Whitlock anticipates." "Most people underestimate what happens," Vivien said, "when you tell a woman the truth and give her room to move." She stood up. "I'll speak to Mrs. Cobb this morning," she said. "And I would suggest you send a note to the registry office requesting the Pendleton boundary documents under direct federal authority, worded specifically enough that Fenwick can't refuse it without creating a formal obstruction record." She paused at the door. "Do you know how to word it that way?" "I have been drafting federal correspondence for 12 years, he said. Something moved across her face, that complicated thing that was not quite a smile, but was something better than nothing. "Good. Then we both have work to do." She walked out. Elias sat in the small parlor in the summer morning heat and looked at the doorway she had just walked through, and for the first time in what felt like a very long time, he found himself in a situation he had not entirely planned for. He found he did not mind. He picked up his pen, and he started to write. Mrs. Cobb was in the kitchen at 8:30, doing what she did every morning, running the household, with the quiet, unbreakable efficiency of a woman who had kept this manor functioning through 3 different occupying families and intended to keep it functioning through whatever came next. She was supervising the bread delivery, disputing a figure in the weekly accounts, and simultaneously communicating to the kitchen girl, through nothing more than the angle of her shoulders, that the way she had arranged the breakfast tray was incorrect and needed to be redone. Vivien walked in and asked if they could speak privately. Mrs. Cobb handed the account book to the kitchen girl, told her to add the column again from the top, and walked Vivien into the small room off the kitchen that served as the housekeeper's domain, a narrow, orderly space that smelled of dried lavender and beeswax and 19 years of competent administration. She closed the door and looked at Vivien with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this conversation for some time and was not surprised it had finally arrived. "You want to know about the judge," she said. "I want to know what you know," Vivien said. "And I want you to know that what you tell me will be used to protect this household, not damage it. Whitlock is not going to let yesterday go quietly. If he moves against this family, we need to understand what we're dealing with." Mrs. Cobb studied her for a long moment. "You're different this morning." "Yes," Vivien said simply. "Something changed." Several things changed. The housekeeper pulled out the chair from behind her small desk and sat down, and she gestured for Vivien to take the other chair, the one that guests used, which itself was a kind of shift, because in 14 months, Vivien had never been invited to sit in Mrs. Cobb's office as anything other than a dependent of the household. "The first Mrs. Whitlock," Mrs. Cobb said, "died in January of 1804. I was employed here at the time. The family was using the manor for the winter season. She was 31 years old and had been married to the judge for 7 years. She paused. She had been trying to leave him for 2 of those years. She had written to her brother in Maryland 3 times requesting assistance. I know this because I carried 2 of those letters to the post myself." Vivien held very still. "Her brother came," Mrs. Cobb continued. "He and the judge had a meeting in that study. The brother left the next morning. 6 weeks later, the first Mrs. Whitlock fell down the main staircase." Her voice was completely flat. The flatness of a woman who has kept something behind glass for a very long time and was now carefully opening the cabinet. The physician who attended her was a Dr. Pruitt. He signed the death certificate within 2 hours of arriving. He did not request a second opinion. He had been in debt to the judge for 4 years. "And the brother," Vivien said, "accepted a land grant in the Kentucky Territory approximately 3 months after his sister's death, land that had previously been in the Whitlock family trust." Mrs. Cobb folded her hands in her lap. "I am not a lawyer, Miss Hale. I cannot tell you what that means in a court of law. I can tell you what it meant to me." Vivien breathed carefully. In out. "And the second wife?" "The second Mrs. Whitlock was younger, 24 when they married. She lasted 4 years." Mrs. Cobb's jaw tightened. "She was a quieter woman than the first. She did not write letters. She did not ask for help. She had learned, I think, very quickly that asking for help was not safe." A pause. "She died of fever." That was what Pruitt wrote. She was 28 years old, and she had been entirely healthy the week before she died. The kitchen sounds filtered through the closed door, the bread being sliced, the kitchen girl probably still struggling with the accounts column. "Mrs. Cobb," Vivien said quietly, "will you tell this to Mr. Worthington?" The housekeeper looked at her. "The federal man. He has a professional stake in Whitlock's position in this county. He also—" She paused, deciding how to say the next part. "He is the reason I am sitting in this chair having this conversation, instead of counting down the days to September." Mrs. Cobb was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Adelaide tells me Fenwick received a federal inquiry this morning about the Pendleton boundary documents." "Already?" Vivien said, surprised. "The man moves quickly." "Yes," Vivien said. "He does." Another silence. Then Mrs. Cobb stood up, which meant the conversation was transitioning into a decision. "I will speak to Mr. Worthington," she said, "this afternoon, after the lunch service." She looked at Vivien with something that was not quite maternal, more like the regard of one competent woman for another, which was rarer and in some ways more sustaining. "You should know, Miss Hale, that I have kept what I know about Horace Whitlock for 8 years, because there was no one to tell it to who could use it correctly. The county magistrate attends his dinners. The state representatives owe him land favors. I was a housekeeper with no legal standing and nothing but my word." She held Vivien's gaze. "A federal investigation is a different instrument entirely." "It is," Vivien said. "Then we understand each other." "I think we always have," Vivien said. "I just wasn't in a position to say so." Mrs. Cobb nodded once the brief, decisive nod of a woman concluding a meeting. "I'll see you at lunch, Miss Hale." Vivien walked back out through the kitchen and through the house and out the side door into the summer heat, and she stood for a moment in the full force of the August morning and felt something shifting inside her, like furniture being moved into better positions in a room that had been arranged wrong for too long. She had work to do. Elias received 3 pieces of significant information before noon. The first was from the county registry office, a terse formal response to his federal inquiry informing him that the Pendleton Creek boundary documents were available for review and that the registry would accommodate a federal representative at his earliest convenience. Fenwick apparently had decided that creating an obstruction record was not worth whatever Whitlock might offer in exchange. Elias read this note, set it in the left pile, and made a mark in his ledger. The second came from his contact Price in Richmond, in response to a specific question Elias had sent by early morning rider the previous day. Price's answer was thorough, and in the context of the unsigned letter Vivien had shown him illuminating. The Whitlock Land Trust had been quietly acquiring debt instruments across Hargrove County for 11 years. Not just the Hale accounts, 4 other families in the county had outstanding notes held by Whitlock interests. All of them had daughters of marriageable age. 2 had already resolved their debts through what Price's letter referred to with considerable professional delicacy as family arrangements. Elias read this 3 times. Then he set it in the left pile as well and made a longer mark in his ledger. The third piece of information arrived in the form of Gerald Hale, who knocked on the parlor door at 11 o'clock and came in wearing the expression of a man who had thought very hard overnight and had arrived somewhere he had not expected to. "I need to tell you something," Gerald said, sitting down across from Elias without preamble, which was its own kind of signal. "About the Pendleton survey." Elias set his pen down and waited. "Whitlock came to me 2 years ago," Gerald said, "when I first arrived in the county with my accounts in the state they were in. He was helpful. He introduced me to people. He extended credit terms that were more generous than the situation warranted. I was grateful." He paused. "He asked me in return for a small favor. He asked me to provide a statement, a personal account. Nothing legal, just a personal letter confirming that the eastern boundary marker of the Pendleton parcel was where his family survey said it was. He said it was a historical matter, a boundary dispute going back 40 years, and my letter would simply corroborate what everyone already knew to be true." "Did you write the letter?" Elias asked. "I wrote the letter," Gerald said. "I had never seen the eastern boundary marker. I had never been to Pendleton Creek. I wrote what he asked me to write because I needed the credit extension, and I told myself it was a harmless formality." He looked at his hands on the table. "I don't know if it is harmless." "It isn't harmless," Elias said. Gerald closed his eyes briefly. "No, I suspected not." He opened them. "What does it mean for the survey?" "It means Whitlock has been collecting false corroboration statements for the boundary claim, which means he knows the legitimate survey doesn't support his position, which means the Pendleton parcel is federal land and has been all along, and he's been drawing income from it under false title for years." Elias said this clearly and without emphasis because information delivered calmly landed harder than information delivered with drama. "It also means, Mr. Hale, that you have participated in a false documentation chain, which is a federal matter." Gerald went very still. "However," Elias continued, and he let Gerald sit with the however for exactly 1 breath before continuing. "A man who comes forward voluntarily with information about a fraudulent documentation scheme before being compelled to do so is treated very differently than a man who is discovered. The former is a witness, the latter is a co-conspirator." The distinction was not subtle. Gerald understood it immediately. "You want a formal statement," he said. "I want the truth on record before Whitlock moves to protect himself," Elias said. "Because he will move. The letter this morning was the opening. He's not a man who accepts a loss without a counter-strategy. And his counter-strategy will almost certainly involve making everything that happened here yesterday look like a financial manipulation by an outside federal interest, which will be very easy to argue if the federal interest in question doesn't have a solid documented foundation for his position. And if I give you the statement, then the foundation is solid," Elias said, "and Whitlock's counter-narrative falls apart before he can build it." Gerald was quiet for a long moment. Then he said with the stiff, uncomfortable dignity of a man doing the right thing several months too late, Tell me what you need me to write. Elias met with Mrs. Cobb at 2 o'clock. She sat across from him in the parlor with the composed authority of a woman who had waited 8 years for a room where her words would carry weight. And she told him what she had told Vivien, and then she told him several additional things she had not told Vivien, because she had not wanted to frighten her unnecessarily. The additional things concerned specific dates, specific witnesses, 2 former servants, and a stable hand who had all left Whitlock employ within 6 months of the second wife's death, and the name of the Maryland brother who had moved to the Kentucky territory, and who, if located, could provide testimony about the letters and the conversation in the study and the land grant that had followed his sister's death. Elias wrote everything down. When she finished, he looked at his notes and then at her. "Mrs. Cobb, why are you telling me this?" She looked back at him with the level gaze of a woman who had decided something irrevocable and was not going to dress it up. "Because Miss Hale sat in my office this morning and asked me to, and because she's the first person in this house in 14 months who has looked at me as though what I know matters." She paused. "And because I have been a housekeeper in Hargrove County for 19 years, and I have watched what men like Horace Whitlock do to women who cannot defend themselves, and I am tired of watching." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Whitlock has done nothing illegal that's easy to prove. The letter chain is circumstantial. The land fraud is cleaner, but it's a property case, not a criminal one. He'll fight it." "He'll fight it," Elias agreed. "But fighting it costs him. Every day he's fighting a federal boundary dispute, and a documentary fraud inquiry is a day he's not operating freely in this county. Men like Whitlock depend on the appearance of unassailable power. Challenge it long enough and publicly enough, and the appearance starts to crack." Mrs. Cobb studied him. "And the girl? What happens to Miss Hale while you're conducting your legal campaign?" "That," Elias said, "is something I intend to discuss with Miss Hale directly. She has some ideas of her own." The housekeeper almost smiled. "Yes," she said. "I imagine she does." The crisis arrived at 4 o'clock in the form of Whitlock himself. He came with 4 men this time, not 2. 4, and they were not the quiet kind. They were the kind whose purpose was to be visible and take up space. He did not come to the front door. He came to the garden gate, which was technically the boundary of the manor property, and he stood at it and sent one of his men to the house with a request. Not a request. A summons for Elias Worthington to come and speak with him. Mrs. Cobb brought the message to the parlor. Elias read it, set it down, straightened his coat. "Where is Miss Hale?" "In the upstairs sitting room with her aunt." "Please ask her to stay there until I return." He walked through the house and out to the garden gate and stopped 6 feet from Whitlock with his hands at his sides and his expression, the perfectly neutral expression of a federal man who had negotiated with people significantly more dangerous than a county magistrate's friend. Whitlock looked at him the way a man looks at something he has decided is an obstacle rather than a person. "Worthington, Judge, you've overstepped yourself considerably. I've conducted a legal debt transfer and filed a federal registry inquiry," Elias said. "Both are well within my authority. Don't be clever with me." Whitlock's voice dropped into the register he used when he wanted people to remember that pleasantness was a choice he made and not a permanent condition. "You came into this county for a land meeting. You had no business involving yourself in private family arrangements." "I agree," Elias said, "that it was outside my original purpose here." Whitlock waited. "I reconsidered my purpose," Elias said. The 4 men shifted slightly. Not a movement toward anything, just a reminder that they were present and large. "The Hale girl has been filling your head with." "Miss Hale," Elias said, "has told me nothing that I did not already observe for myself." He held Whitlock's gaze without effort, the way a man holds a door closed, not with aggression, just with the steady, immovable application of his full weight. "I heard a woman tell a garden that she would rather die than be handed to you. That was sufficient information." A muscle in Whitlock's jaw moved. "She is an hysterical young woman with a romantic notion of her own situation." The arrangement her family made was appropriate and mutually beneficial, and you had no right. No right, Elias said, is an interesting phrase from a man who has used legal and financial coercion to acquire 5 young women as wives or near wives over the course of 11 years. The silence that followed was the kind that has edges. Whitlock's face did not change. That was the tell. A man with nothing to hide gets angry at an accusation like that. A man with everything to hide gets still. "You want to be very careful, Worthington," he said quietly. "I am always careful," Elias said. "It's a professional habit. A federal land advisor who creates personal entanglements in the counties he's investigating is not a man who keeps his federal position for long. There are people in Washington who owe me. There are people in Washington who owe everyone something," Elias said. "The question is who they owe more. I've been at this work for 12 years, Judge. The men in Washington who matter to my position are men I have served at considerably higher stakes than a county boundary dispute." He tilted his head slightly. "But I appreciate the reminder that you're considering that avenue. It tells me something useful about your current position." Whitlock stared at him. "The Pendleton boundary documents will be reviewed this week," Elias said, his voice still entirely conversational. "The registry has confirmed access. The review will be thorough. If the survey supports the federal boundary, the trust's claim to the eastern parcels will be formally disputed. If there is documentation irregularity in the corroboration chain—" He paused, letting that land. "Well, that becomes a different kind of proceeding entirely." Something moved behind Whitlock's eyes. Fast. The involuntary calculation of a man who just registered that his opponent knows more than he should. "This county," Whitlock said, "will not look kindly on federal interference in local property rights." "This county," Elias said, "contains several families who hold debt notes under your trust and who may have opinions about how those notes were acquired and what was asked in exchange for them." Complete stillness. "Good afternoon, Judge," Elias said. He turned and walked back toward the house. He had taken 10 steps when Whitlock said behind him very quietly, "The girl is going to be a problem for you, Worthington. Women who make themselves problems in this county tend to find the county very uncomfortable." Elias stopped walking. He stood with his back to Whitlock for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned around. He walked back to the gate, and he stopped close enough that the 4 large men took an involuntary half-step forward, and he looked at Horace Whitlock at close range, and he said with no drama and no volume and absolute clarity, "If anything happens to Vivian Hale, anything at all, I will make it my singular professional purpose to ensure that every federal instrument available to me is applied to every financial interest you hold in this state. I will do this not as a threat and not as negotiation. I will do it as a fact, and you will find, Judge, that I am a man who keeps his word." He held the eye contact for one breath. Then he turned and walked back to the house and did not look back again. He found Vivien in the downstairs hallway. She had not stayed in the upstairs sitting room. She was standing at the side window where she could see the garden gate, and she had clearly seen enough of the conversation to understand the shape of it, even if she could not hear the words. She looked at him when he came in, and her eyes went to his face with the fast, searching attention of a woman reading a situation. "What did he say?" she asked. "He reminded me that federal men who create personal entanglements lose their positions," Elias said. "He implied that Washington contacts could create professional difficulties. He indicated that the county would resist federal interference in property matters, and he suggested—" He paused. "He suggested that you would be a problem for me, and that women who make problems in this county find it uncomfortable." Vivien's face went through several things. Fear was one of them. She let it show, and then she put it somewhere it could be managed and looked at him steadily. "He threatened me." "He implied a threat, yes. And you." "The threats to me are professional. I'm equipped to handle those." He met her eyes. "The implication about you concerns me more." "What did you say to him?" He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You told him that anything that happened to me would result in the full force of federal interest applied to his financial holdings. Yes. You said that. I meant it. She looked at him across the hallway in the hot afternoon, and there was something happening in her expression that he found he could not entirely interpret, which was unusual for him. It was not simple gratitude. It was not relief. It was something more complicated, the look of a person recalibrating carefully and seriously the landscape around them. That was... She stopped. Started again. No one has ever said anything like that on my behalf. No, he said. I don't imagine they have. You understand that saying it makes this personal, she said. Whatever professional cover existed for your involvement in this situation threatening Whitlock on my behalf removes it, he said. Yes, I'm aware. Why? She asked. And it was the same question she had asked him in the garden the first morning. But it was a different question now, not the question of a stranger, but the question of someone who had spent 2 days watching him closely and wanted to understand what she was seeing. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. Because he stood at that gate, he said finally, and used you as a means of threatening me. And I found I was not willing to allow that. He looked at her directly. You are not a means, Miss Hale. Not for him. Not for your uncle. Not for me. And I needed him to understand that I understand that, because men like Whitlock only respect information that is delivered at a cost. She held his gaze for a long time. The survey, she said finally. When do you go to the registry? Tomorrow morning. I want to come. He blinked. To the registry. I know Fenwick, she said. I have met him socially through my aunt's connections. He is a man who behaves differently in the presence of social familiarity. If he becomes difficult about the access, my presence changes the dynamic. She tilted her head. And I am tired of sitting in this house waiting to find out what happens to my life. He looked at her. Then he said, The registry opens at 9. I'll be ready at 8:30, she said. She turned and walked toward the stairs, and she had made it to the second step when the front door opened behind Elias without a knock, and Gerald came in from the direction of the drive with his face the color of old paper and a letter in his hand. Gerald, Vivien said from the stairs, what's happened? Gerald looked up at her, and then at Elias, and then back at her. And the look on his face was the look of a man who had just understood too late how far behind he had been in a game he thought he was playing. Whitlock, he said. He's filed a civil complaint with the county magistrate. Against me. He held up the letter. For breach of contract. He's claiming the engagement agreement was a binding financial instrument and that dissolving it constitutes default on the underlying debt. Vivien came back down the stairs. Can he do that? She asked Elias. He can file it, Elias said. Whether it holds is a different matter. The debt was transferred before the complaint was filed. The legal ground is thin. He took the letter from Gerald and read it quickly. He knows the ground is thin. This is not about winning the case. It's about cost, about making the legal process expensive and public and uncomfortable enough that Gerald withdraws cooperation. Cooperation with what? Gerald asked, and then he looked at Elias and understood. With you. He knows you've been talking to me. He knows I've been talking to everyone, Elias said. That is precisely the point. He is attempting to isolate me by making cooperation with me costly. Then what do we do? Gerald asked. You do nothing, Elias said. You have already given me a signed statement. You do not retract it. You do not engage with Whitlock's solicitor independently, and you do not communicate with Whitlock at all. Refer everything to me. And the civil complaint will be answered, Elias said, by a federal counter-filing that raises the question of documentary fraud in the boundary corroboration chain, which will redirect the magistrate's attention very efficiently. Gerald stared at him. You can do that. I have a signed statement from a county resident describing his participation in a false corroboration scheme under financial duress, Elias said. Yes, I can do that. Gerald sat down heavily on the hallway bench. He looked older than he had that morning. I've made a mess of this. Yes, Elias said without cruelty. "But you're cleaning it up. That matters." Vivien was standing very still near the foot of the stairs, and she was looking at her uncle with an expression that was complicated in ways she was clearly still working through. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something in the direction of it. The acknowledgement, perhaps, that people were capable of being more than the worst thing they had done. "Gerald," she said quietly, "go have supper. Let Mr. Worthington work." Gerald looked up at her. Something in his face broke slightly the way ice breaks when a weight is removed. "Vivien." "I know," she said. "Go eat." He went. Elias watched the exchange and said nothing about it because some moments are not his to interpret. "The registry," Vivien said, turning back to him. 8:30. 8:30, he confirmed. She went upstairs. He went back to the parlor and spread the documents across the table. The transfer confirmation Gerald's statement. Mrs. Cobb's account in his own notes. Price's information from Richmond. The civil complaint, the unsigned letter, and he sat with all of it arranged in front of him, and understood with the clear professional certainty of a man who had read many rooms in many difficult years, that what had begun as a boundary survey had become something considerably larger. Whitlock had made a systematic pattern of acquiring women through financial coercion across 11 years and at least 5 families. 2 of those women were dead. The boundary fraud was the mechanism, the tool by which he built the financial leverage that made the coercion possible. And Elias now had in the papers on this table the components of a case that could end it. What he did not have, not yet, was the Kentucky brother, the man who had taken a land grant in exchange for walking away from his dead sister. If that man would testify, the circumstantial shape of the thing became something a federal proceeding could act on. He picked up his pen. He wrote a letter to Price in Richmond. "Find me a man named Edward Marsh," he wrote. Last known location, Kentucky Territory, approximately 1807. He received a land grant from the Whitlock Family Trust in exchange for his silence about his sister's death. I need to know if he is still alive. I need to know if he can be reached. And I need to know if after 8 years he is willing to talk. He sealed it. He set it in the pile for the morning rider. Outside, the summer evening pressed down on the Virginia fields, and in the house around him, 3 people, a frightened uncle, a housekeeper with 8 years of kept knowledge, and a woman who had stopped being careful. In the way that made her invisible, were all in their own ways deciding how far they were willing to go. Elias Worthington looked at the papers on his table. He had come to this county for a boundary survey. He was beginning to understand that he had arrived at something that would take considerably more than a survey to resolve. And he found somewhere beneath the professional calculation and the 12 years of careful detachment that he was not sorry. He was not sorry at all. The morning rider left before dawn. Elias heard him go. The sound of hooves on the drive, pulling him up from a shallow sleep at 4:30, and he lay in the dark for a moment, listening to the house settle back into silence and thinking about Edward Marsh, a man who had walked away from his sister's death for a piece of Kentucky land. A man who had been living with that trade for 8 years. People who made those trades either hardened into the decision over time, built walls around it until they couldn't feel the shape of it anymore, or they softened. Grew raw. Spent years in a private negotiation with themselves about what they had done and why and whether there was any version of it they could live with. Elias needed Marsh to be the second kind. He got up at 5 and worked until 8 because there was nothing else productive to do with the hours between a letter sent and a letter answered. And productive work was the discipline that had kept him functional through 12 years of situations where waiting was the most dangerous thing you could be doing. At 8:25, Vivien came downstairs. She was dressed plainly, practically in the way of a woman who had understood that this morning was not a social occasion. She had her hair pinned back with the kind of efficiency that meant she had done it herself without a maid's assistance, and she was carrying a small leather portfolio that he recognized after a moment as one from Gerald's study. "I borrowed it," she said, seeing his glance. "Gerald has his statement on record. He doesn't need the portfolio." "What's in it?" "A copy of the engagement dissolution document. A letter from my aunt confirming that the arrangement with Whitlock was conducted without my consent. She wrote it last night. She was up until midnight, I heard her. She paused. And a list of names. What names? Women, she said. The other families in the county with outstanding notes to the Whitlock Trust. I went through Dorothea's social correspondence last night. She keeps everything, every invitation, every calling card, every note. I found references to 3 of the 5 families Price mentioned in his letter to you. She held his gaze. I know 2 of the daughters personally. One of them is 17. Elias was very still. 17, he said. Her name is Clara Pettigrew. Her father's notes came due last spring. The Whitlock Trust extended them 6 months. Vivian's voice was even, but her hands on the portfolio were not. 6 months extension. Expires in October. The weight of that settled over the room like a second summer heat. We go to the registry, Elias said, and then we talk about Clara Pettigrew. Fenwick was exactly the kind of man Vivien had described, a small, precise, deeply anxious person who managed his anxiety by maintaining absolute procedural correctness in all things, because procedure was the one domain of his life he could fully control. He greeted Elias with the careful professional courtesy of a man responding to federal authority, and he greeted Vivien with the fluttery social relief of someone encountering a familiar face in a situation that had been making him very nervous since the previous morning's federal inquiry. Miss Hale, he said, and visibly relaxed 3 degrees. Mr. Fenwick, she said warmly. I hope Adelaide is well. Quite well, thank you, quite well. He was already leading them toward the records room with the forward momentum of a man who had decided that cooperation was the correct course of action and wanted to execute it before he could reconsider. The Pendleton documents, yes, I have them prepared. The original survey from 1791, the boundary deposition from 1798, the trust claim filing from 1803, and the corroboration letters. He paused at the records room door. There are 11 corroboration letters. They were filed across a period of 7 years. 11, Elias said. The trust was thorough, Fenwick said with the careful neutrality of a man who had his own opinions about what he was looking at and had been keeping them meticulously to himself. They went in. The original survey took Elias 4 minutes to read, and 3 more to compare against the trust's boundary claim. Vivien watched him work the way he moved through the documents with the focused economy of someone who had done this specific kind of reading many times and knew exactly where to look for the thing he was looking for. She watched his face. When he found it, he did not make a sound. He just went still for a moment, the particular stillness of a man whose professional instinct has been confirmed. Then he looked up at Fenwick. The 1791 survey places the eastern boundary marker at the creek's second bend, he said. The trust claim filed in 1803 describes the eastern boundary as the creek's third bend. That's a difference of approximately 40 acres. Fenwick said nothing. He was looking at a point somewhere above Elias's left shoulder. The corroboration letters, Elias said. All 11 of them. What do they describe? They describe the boundary as the third bend, Fenwick said quietly. All 11. Yes. And the 11 individuals who signed these letters, were any of them present at the 1791 survey? No, Fenwick said. The surveyor died in 1795. His assistant relocated to Pennsylvania in 1799. There are no living witnesses to the original survey. Which means the only documentation of the 1791 boundary is the survey document itself, Elias said. Yes, sir. And 11 private citizens who signed letters saying something different. Yes, sir. Elias set the documents down with the careful deliberateness of a man deciding how to handle something fragile. Mr. Fenwick, when the trust filed these corroboration letters, were you registry clerk at that time? Fenwick's jaw tightened. I was assistant clerk. And did the clerk at that time, did anyone review the letters against the original survey for consistency? The silence that followed was exactly as long as a guilty conscience takes to decide whether honesty is survivable. No, Fenwick said. They were filed as supplementary documentation. Standard procedure was to file without cross-verification. Standard procedure, Elias said. Yes, Mr. Fenwick? Elias's voice was quiet, direct, and entirely without cruelty. I am going to ask you to hold these documents under federal administrative review, which means they cannot be accessed or modified by any outside party while the review is ongoing. I am going to give you a formal federal notice of review right now, which will protect you professionally from any pressure to release or alter these records. And I am going to ask you, as a matter of federal inquiry, whether you have any personal knowledge of the circumstances under which those 11 corroboration letters were obtained. Fenwick looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat down in the chair beside the record shelves, as though his legs had made a unilateral decision, and he said, 3 of the men who signed those letters came to me afterward. Not officially, socially, over a period of 2 years. They each said in different ways in different contexts that they had signed something they did not fully understand, that they had been told it was a formality, that there had been arrangements made. What kind of arrangements? Elias said. Debt extensions, Fenwick said. Credit terms. A land parcel in one case. He looked at his hands. I didn't know what to do with it. I had no authority to act on private conversations. The county magistrate at that time was... He stopped. Was a close associate of the Whitlock family. Elias finished. Yes. Vivien had not moved from her position near the door. She was watching Fenwick with the steady, compassionate attention of a woman who understood exactly what it felt like to know the right thing and have no ground to stand on while knowing it. Mr. Fenwick, she said quietly, would you be willing to write down what you just told us? He looked at her. Not for the county, she said. For the federal record. For the inquiry Mr. Worthington is conducting. You would have federal protection from retaliation as a cooperative witness. Mr. Worthington can document that protection formally today before you write a single word. She looked at Elias. Yes, Elias said immediately. That protection is within my authority to extend, and I will document it right now. Fenwick was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, Adelaide's brother works for the Whitlock stable. If the judge retaliates, I will make it explicitly clear in the federal record, Elias said, that any action against any member of your family or household following your cooperation with this inquiry will be treated as federal witness intimidation, which carries consequences significantly more severe than a county civil complaint. He held Fenwick's gaze. You have my word. Fenwick looked at him, then at Vivien, then back at the documents on the table. Give me the paper, he said. They were back at the manor by 11. Elias went straight to the parlor and began building the formal federal review filing while the Fenwick conversation was still fully present in his mind. Vivien went to find Mrs. Cobb because there was something she needed to know about Clara Pettigrew's family, and Mrs. Cobb was the most reliable source of county knowledge she had access to. Mrs. Cobb knew the Pettigrew household. She knew it well enough to confirm that Thomas Pettigrew's debt notes to the Whitlock Trust had been extended twice, not once. That the extension terms had become progressively more personal in their requirements. That Clara Pettigrew had been withdrawn from the county assembly circuit 3 months ago, which in Hargrove County's social calendar was the equivalent of a young woman being made to disappear from public view. And that Clara's mother, a woman named Ruth Pettigrew, had called on Dorothea twice in the past 2 months, in what Mrs. Cobb described with careful precision as a state of considerable distress that she was attempting very hard to disguise as social visiting. Vivien stood in the kitchen doorway after Mrs. Cobb finished and understood that this was not just her story. It had never only been her story. She went back to the parlor and knocked on the open door and came in without waiting for an answer, and she said, Clara Pettigrew's mother has been here twice in 2 months. She's in the same situation I was in. The notes are called in October, and the girl has been pulled from public circulation. Elias looked up from his writing. We need to move faster, Vivien said. The federal review filing will... October is 11 weeks away, she said. Filing a review protects the documents. It does not protect Clara Pettigrew. He held her gaze. She was right, And he knew she was right, and the professional part of his mind was already recalculating the sequencing of what needed to happen and in what order. The debt notes, he said. The Pettigrew family's notes, who holds them? The same trust account as the Hale notes, Vivien said. It's all the same instrument. That's what Price's letter said. 5 families, same trust. If the trust's title to the Pendleton parcel is formally challenged, Elias said slowly, thinking aloud, the trust's financial standing in the county becomes complicated. The notes it holds become legally contestable. An entity operating under fraudulent title documentation has questionable authority to collect on instruments issued under that title. Vivien watched him. That is not a clean legal argument, he said. It would take time to establish in court. We don't have time, she said. No. He agreed. We don't. He sat back. I need to file the review and simultaneously petition for a federal administrative hold on all debt collection activity by the Whitlock trust accounts, pending resolution of the title dispute. That is a more aggressive instrument. It requires stronger justification. You have Gerald's statement, she said. Fenwick's account, Mrs. Cobb's testimony, 11 fraudulent corroboration letters sitting in a federal reviewed file. And no direct connection yet to the deaths of 2 women, he said. The word hung in the room. Edward Marsh, Vivien said quietly. I need him, Elias said. The rest of it is property fraud, serious prosecutable but property fraud. What Marsh can provide, if he's willing, is the evidence that the financial coercion was part of a pattern that cost women their lives. That changes the nature of the federal interest from a civil property matter to something considerably more significant. And if he's not willing, if 8 years has made him hard instead of soft. Elias was quiet. Then, we work with what we have. The Pettigrew girl? I will file the administrative hold this afternoon, he said. Regardless of Marsh, it will create immediate legal friction around all the trust's debt collection activity. It buys time. How much time? Enough, he said. I think. She held his gaze. You think. I won't lie to you about certainty I don't have, he said. She absorbed that. Nodded once, the nod of a woman who had asked for honesty and received it, and was deciding that this was in fact what she had wanted, even when the honest answer was insufficient. Then the front door opened with a force that was well beyond social convention, and Gerald's voice came down the hallway at a volume that Gerald's voice did not typically reach. Both of them were on their feet before he appeared in the parlor doorway. He was breathing hard. He had come from outside, his coat was dusty, his hat was in his hand, and his face had the particular colorless quality of a man who has received information that has physically affected him. There's been a rider, he said, from the Pettigrew household. Vivien's hand went to the doorframe. Clara Pettigrew, Gerald said, has run. Silence. She left the house this morning, he continued, before dawn, on foot. Her mother found the room empty at 6 o'clock and sent riders out. They found the horse she had tried to take. It had thrown her at the north pasture fence. She wasn't on it. He looked at Vivien, then at Elias. They don't know where she is. Vivien was already moving. Where would she go? She said, not to Gerald, to herself, moving through the mental geography of what she knew. If she ran on foot from the north pasture, the road north goes toward the county seat that's 40 miles, that's not survivable on foot without money. The road east goes toward the Marsh Creek Ford, Elias said. He had a county map on the table, the one from the registry documents, and he had it open before Vivien had finished her sentence. She looked at the map, at the ford. If she was trying to reach someone, if she had arranged anything, any contact outside the county, or if she was just running and had no plan and was somewhere between the north pasture and the ford, Elias said, then she has been on foot in the August heat for 5 hours. He was pulling on his coat. You can't search the county as a federal man without creating a spectacle, Vivien said. If Whitlock hears, I'm not going as a federal man, he said. He looked at her. I need someone who knows the land between here and that ford, someone local. Someone who won't draw attention. She was already at the door. Mrs. Cobb's nephew drives the supply cart to the East Farms every Tuesday. He knows every track between here and the ford. She turned. Gerald, tell no one. Not Aunt Dorothea, not the servants. No one. Gerald stared at her. Vivien, you cannot. I am not asking permission, she said, and walked out. They found Clara Pettigrew 2 hours later. She was 17 years old, and she was sitting in the dry grass at the edge of the creek bank, half a mile from the Marsh Creek ford, and she had a twisted ankle from the fall at the pasture fence, and no water, and no plan, and the specific hollow-eyed expression of someone who has used everything they had to get to where they are, and arrived there to discover they did not know what came next. She looked up when she heard them coming, and she pulled herself back against the creek bank with the desperate animal fear of someone who had been running from men all morning. Vivien dropped off the supply cart before it fully stopped and crossed the creek bank grass with her hands out and open, and her voice low and steady, and said, Clara, my name is Vivian Hale. I know your mother. I know what's happening with your father's notes. You are safe. I promise you, you are safe. Clara Pettigrew looked at her with the eyes of someone who had stopped believing promises. Who is he? She said, looking at Elias, who had stayed back by the cart. His name is Elias Worthington, Vivien said. He is the reason I am not going to be Mrs. Whitlock. She crouched down to Clara's level in the creek bank grass. He is going to make sure you aren't either. Clara's face broke, not loudly. Quietly, the quiet collapse of a person who has been holding themselves together with their last available strength and has just been given permission to stop. She pressed both hands over her mouth, and her whole body shook, and Vivien put her arms around her and held her and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else to say yet. Just the holding. Just the simple animal warmth of another person who understood. Elias stood by the cart and looked at the two women in the creek bank grass, and felt something move through him that was not professional or strategic or calculated in any way at all. He had come to this county for a survey. He had found something that had been hidden in plain sight for 11 years, waiting for someone with enough standing to look at it directly. He had found Vivian Hale in a garden. He had not planned any of this. He was beginning to understand that the things you don't plan for are sometimes the ones that matter most. They got Clara back to the manor before 4 o'clock. Ruth Pettigrew arrived an hour later, having been sent word through Mrs. Cobb's network of household connections, which operated faster and more reliably than any formal communication in Hargrove County. She came in through the kitchen door with the particular walk of a woman who has been frightened out of all her social habits and is moving on pure instinct. And when she saw her daughter sitting in the kitchen with her ankle wrapped and a cup of tea in her hands, she stopped in the doorway and pressed her fist against her sternum and breathed. Mrs. Pettigrew, Elias said from the table. I am Elias Worthington, Federal Land Administration. I need you to listen to me very carefully and then tell me what you want to do. She looked at him, then at her daughter, then back at him. What is happening? I am conducting a federal investigation into fraudulent land title documentation held by the Whitlock Family Trust, he said. As part of that investigation, I am filing a petition for an administrative hold on all debt collection activity by the trust pending resolution of the title dispute. If that hold is granted, and I believe it will be, the notes against your husband's accounts cannot be called or enforced until the investigation concludes. Ruth Pettigrew's hands were shaking. How long will it take? Months, he said honestly. Possibly longer. Legal proceedings of this kind are not fast. And in the meantime, no one can compel your family to honor the notes. No one can use them as leverage for any arrangement. And any attempt to do so will constitute interference with a federal administrative proceeding. She looked at him with the look of a woman who wants to believe something so much that she is afraid the wanting itself will make it untrue. Is that real? Can you actually do that? It is real, he said. I am doing it tonight. She sat down. Clara reached across the table and took her mother's hand, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the kitchen was very quiet. Then Ruth looked up. What do you need from us? A statement, he said. From you and from your husband if he's willing. describing the circumstances under which the debt was extended and what was communicated regarding the terms. "Thomas will be afraid," she said. "I know. That's a reasonable response." He met her eyes. "But 5 families are in this position, Mrs. Pettigrew, and 2 women in this county are already dead. I believe Whitlock has operated this way for 11 years and has been protected by the financial and social architecture of this county for all of it. The only thing that ends it is enough people being willing to be on record at the same time." She was quiet. Then she said, "2 women. 2 previous wives," he said, "under circumstances that were never adequately investigated." Ruth Pettigrew's face did something complicated and slow. "I heard things," she said. "I didn't let myself think about them." "I know," he said. "I was afraid if I thought about them, I would have to do something," she said, "and I didn't know what I could do." "You can do this," he said. She looked at her daughter. Clara said very quietly, "Mama, say yes." Ruth Pettigrew straightened in her chair. "Tell me what to write." By the time Vivien came downstairs from settling Clara in the upstairs guest room, the kitchen table had become a working document station with 3 separate statements in various stages of completion, and Elias still writing his coat off, and his sleeves pushed back to the elbow, and his handwriting as steady and precise as it had been that morning. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. He was not aware of her for a moment. He was concentrating entirely on the paper in front of him, and in that moment of unguarded focus, he looked younger than he usually did, less defended, less deliberate. More like a person, and less like a professional instrument. Then he looked up and saw her, and something in his face shifted back to awareness. "Clara is sleeping," she said. "Good. Mrs. Pettigrew is in the sitting room with my aunt." She came in and sat down across from him. "How does it look?" "Better," he said. "The Pettigrew statement, in combination with Gerald's, gives me corroborating accounts from 2 independent families describing the same pattern of debt extension tied to family arrangement demands. That significantly strengthens the federal hold petition." He set his pen down and looked at her directly. "I want to be honest with you. The hold will protect the Pettigrew girl for as long as the investigation runs. It may protect the other families as well. But it doesn't end Whitlock's social influence in this county. It doesn't prevent him from retaliating through channels that aren't financial." "You mean the county magistrate," she said. "And the social architecture," he said. "The families in this county who owe him favors, the men who have dinner with him, the doors that can be opened or closed." He paused. "This fight is not over when I file the petition tonight. It is in some ways just beginning." She looked at him steadily. "I know that. Your situation in this household is mine to manage," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He held her gaze. Something had shifted between them over the course of this day, not dramatically, not in a way that would be visible to anyone watching from outside, but Vivien felt it with the precise awareness of a woman who had spent 14 months noticing everything, because noticing was the only power she had. The distance between them, the professional distance, the stranger distance, had quietly, imperceptibly, without announcement or ceremony, become something smaller. It was not yet something she knew what to call, but she knew its shape. "Elias," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both registered it in the same moment. He did not make anything of it. He just looked at her and waited. "The woman you didn't help," she said. 6 years ago. The one who ended up in a small life." He was very still. "Does she know that this is—" She paused, finding the right words. "Does she know that you've been thinking about it all this time?" "No," he said. "Would it help her to know?" He thought about that. A long time. With the particular gravity of a man who does not give quick answers to real questions. "I don't know," he said finally. "I don't know if knowing that someone regretted standing still is comfort or a different kind of wound." She looked at him. "What would it have meant to you," she said quietly, "if you had been the one in that position, and someone had regretted standing still?" He was quiet for a very long time. "I think," he said, "that I would have wanted to know." "Then tell her," Vivien said. He looked at her. She held his gaze across the kitchen table, across the spread of documents that represented 12 years of hidden cruelty and the slow beginning of accountability across the distance that had been growing smaller all day without either of them naming it. And she said, "When this is finished, when Clara Pettigrew is safe and the petition is filed and the documents are on record, go tell her. Whatever it means to her, she deserves to hear it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "She moved to Charleston 2 years ago." "That's not so far," Vivien said. "No," he said. "It isn't." Outside, the summer evening was settling over Virginia, heavy and golden, the kind of evening that slows everything down to its essential weight. Somewhere in the house, Clara Pettigrew was sleeping the exhausted sleep of someone who had run as far as she could and been caught by the right people. Ruth Pettigrew and Dorothea were in the sitting room with the careful, tentative quality of two women discovering they had more in common than they had previously permitted themselves to acknowledge. Gerald was in his study with the statement he had written, and the particular quietness of a man sitting with the better version of himself and hoping it was not too late. Elias picked up his pen. He looked at the documents in front of him. Then he looked at Vivien, who was still sitting across the table from him, and he said, "I need 2 more hours to finish this." "Then you have 2 more hours," she said. "I'll tell Mrs. Cobb to hold supper." She stood up. "Vivien," he said. She stopped. "Whatever happens next," he stopped, started again with the precision of a man who does not say imprecise things. "Whatever the investigation produces, whatever Whitlock does in response, whatever the county does." He held her gaze. "I want you to know that I am not going to stand still this time." She looked at him for a long moment in the golden evening light. "I know," she said, and she walked out to tell Mrs. Cobb about supper, and Elias Worthington put his pen to the paper and began to build line by careful line the legal structure that would take an 11-year predator apart. He worked with the focused, unhurried certainty of a man who has finally found the right purpose for all of his skills. And for the first time in 6 years, his hands did not hesitate. The federal petition was filed at 7 o'clock the following morning. Elias had ridden to the county seat himself before breakfast, before the heat had fully committed to the day, and he had placed the document in the hands of the federal administrative officer with the particular quiet force of a man who has spent 2 hours on horseback, rehearsing exactly what he intends to say, and is now saying it without a single wasted syllable. The administrative hold on all Whitlock Trust debt collection activity was formally entered into the federal record by 8:15. By 9 o'clock, a copy had been dispatched by federal rider to the magistrate's office, to the county registry, and to the solicitor whose name appeared on Whitlock's civil complaint against Gerald. By 10 o'clock, Hargrove County knew. Not through official channels. Through the channels that actually moved information in a county like this one. The dry goods store, the post office, the kitchen doors of the 6 largest households. The specific, unstoppable current of social knowledge that ran beneath every formal structure in every American county in 1812 and moved faster than any rider. Vivien heard it from Mrs. Cobb at 10:30, who had heard it from the milk delivery boy, who had heard it from his mother, who had heard it from the woman who did the Fenwick household laundry. The federal government had put a hold on Whitlock's debt instruments. The federal government was investigating his land title. The federal government had a document signed by Gerald Hale and 3 other county residents describing a pattern of financial coercion tied to family arrangements. And Horace Whitlock, for the first time in 11 years of operating in Hargrove County, as though consequence was something that happened to other people, had woken up to a morning in which his financial architecture was officially, publicly, federally under question. Vivien stood in the kitchen and listened to Mrs. Cobb relay all of this, and felt something move through her that was not triumph. Triumph was too simple for it. It was the feeling of a structure that has been pressing down on you for a very long time, beginning slowly to shift its weight. "He will not accept this quietly," she said. "No," Mrs. Cobb agreed. "He won't." She was right. Whitlock's response arrived not as a writer and not as a letter. It arrived as 3 men on horseback at the front gate at 11 o'clock, and they were not his usual quiet men. These were men from the county sheriff's office riding with a formal writ, and behind them came a solicitor named Graves, who had represented Whitlock's family interests for 20 years, and who arrived with the expression of a man who had been given very specific instructions and intended to execute them with maximum legal efficiency. Elias met them at the gate. He had seen the riders coming from the parlor window, and he had taken the 30 seconds between the window and the gate to make his face into the face of a man who had been expecting this and finds it neither surprising nor concerning, because in negotiations of this kind, the first thing you surrender is the appearance of being unsettled. "Mr. Worthington," the solicitor said, "I represent the Whitlock Family Trust. I have a writ here from the county magistrate ordering the suspension of the federal administrative filing on the grounds that federal jurisdiction has not been properly established in this county for matters relating to private trust instruments." Elias looked at the writ. He did not reach for it. "The county magistrate does not have authority to suspend a federal administrative proceeding," he said. "That authority belongs to a federal circuit judge. The county magistrate has certified." "The county magistrate has written something on a piece of paper," Elias said pleasantly. "That is not the same as having authority." He looked at Graves with the calm attention of a man who respects capable opponents enough to be direct with them. "Mr. Graves, you know the law. You know this writ doesn't hold. You are here because your client wanted something visible to happen this morning that would signal to this county that he is still operating from a position of power. I understand the strategy. It is not going to work, and I think you know that." Graves looked at him, the look of a man doing a rapid private recalculation. "The trust will pursue this through every available legal channel." "I would expect nothing less," Elias said. "Pursue them. I'll see you in the federal circuit." He tilted his head slightly. "I should tell you, Mr. Graves, that the federal administrative file now contains sworn statements from 4 county residents describing a consistent pattern of financial coercion over 11 years. It also contains the registry documentation establishing fraudulent corroboration of the boundary claim. When the circuit reviews the hold, they will review all of it. Are you certain your client wants that proceeding to move forward?" Graves was very still. "Because there is another option," Elias said. "If the trust withdraws the civil complaint against Gerald Hale, releases all outstanding debt notes against the 5 families currently held in the trust's collection instruments and files, a voluntary correction of the boundary documentation with the registry. I will advise the Federal Administrative Office that the voluntary correction renders the investigative hold unnecessary." He paused. "Your client keeps the Pendleton parcel. He loses 40 acres he was never legally entitled to. He loses the financial leverage over 5 families. And the federal record contains a correction rather than a fraud finding." The 3 sheriff's men sat on their horses and said nothing. This was not their conversation. Graves looked at the writ in his hand, then at Elias. "You're offering him an exit." "I'm offering him a smaller loss than the alternative," Elias said. "What I'm not offering is unlimited time to consider it. The Federal Circuit review will be scheduled within the week. Once that proceeding begins, the voluntary correction option is no longer available." "I'll convey the offer," Graves said. "You have 48 hours, Elias said, and walked back to the house. He was through the door and into the hallway before he let his shoulders release the tension he'd been holding through that entire conversation, because there was no value in letting it go in front of Whitlock's solicitor, and there was no reason to keep holding it once he was past the threshold. Vivien was in the hallway. She had heard everything through the open window. She looked at him with the searching directness that he had come to understand was her particular way of reading a situation, not asking for reassurance, asking for accuracy. "Will he take it?" "I don't know," Elias said honestly. "He's a man who has never accepted a smaller loss when he believed he could avoid any loss at all. But the circuit review changes his calculus. If the fraud finding goes on federal record, his ability to conduct any financial business in this state becomes significantly compromised." "And the women," she said. The two wives. That doesn't get resolved by a voluntary correction. He held her gaze. No, it doesn't. He paused. I'm still waiting on Marsh, the Kentucky brother. The name had been living in the back of every conversation for 3 days, a variable that neither of them had stopped accounting for. How long? Price sent a rider. Kentucky is 8 days out and 8 days back. He did a quiet calculation. If Marsh is findable, and if Price moves fast, we have a response in 12 to 16 days. Before the circuit review. Possibly. She looked at him. And if Marsh won't talk, then the property fraud case stands on its own, he said. It protects the living. It ends the financial coercion. It costs Whitlock significant standing. He was quiet for a moment. But it does not give the first Mrs. Whitlock or the second Mrs. Whitlock anything. The hallway held that truth between them without flinching. Some things, Vivien said quietly, can't be made right. They can only be stopped from continuing. Yes, he said. She straightened. Then we stop it from continuing. The 48 hours passed with the specific grinding tension of hours that contain things you cannot control. Clara Pettigrew remained at the manor, her ankle healing her mother, coming every morning and staying through supper. Ruth Pettigrew had spoken to her husband by the end of the first day, and Thomas Pettigrew, a quiet, angular man who had the look of someone who had been afraid for a long time and was exhausted by it, came on the second morning and sat in Gerald's study with Elias for 2 hours, and came out looking like a different weight was on him. Still heavy, but different. The weight of a man who has handed something to someone else to carry, rather than the weight of a man carrying it entirely alone. Gerald had, without announcement or ceremony, become useful. He knew people in the county, not Whitlock's people, but the layer beneath, that the smaller landowners and the tradesmen and the families who had been navigating the shadow of Whitlock's influence for years without any mechanism for addressing it. He began quietly to talk to them, not agitating, just talking. The way information moves in a place where it has been suppressed for a long time, finding the cracks and moving through them. He came to Elias on the afternoon of the second day with 2 additional names, men who had signed corroboration letters for the boundary claim and who, having heard through the county's invisible communication network that the federal investigation existed and that other people were on record, wanted to know what it meant to add their names to the official account. Elias spent that afternoon with both of them. By evening, the federal file had 6 sworn statements, not 4. Vivien watched all of this from her own particular position, not at the center of it, not at the edge, but woven through it in the way that someone who knows the texture of a place is always woven through the events that happen there. She moved between Mrs. Cobb and Clara and Ruth Pettigrew and her aunt and Gerald, carrying information and steadiness and the specific kind of calm that comes not from the absence of fear, but from having decided that fear is not going to be the thing that determines your next action. She had not been alone with Elias since the kitchen conversation 2 nights before. Not because they were avoiding each other, because the work had not stopped long enough to allow for a different kind of conversation. And both of them knew it, and both of them were. She thought not entirely displeased about having something to fill the space where the other conversation would otherwise have to be. The reply from Graves arrived on the morning of the 3rd day. Elias read it at the parlor table, and then he set it down and sat with it for a moment before he called Vivien in. She came and stood in the doorway and looked at his face and knew before he said a word that the answer was not the one they had hoped for. "He won't take the exit," she said. "He wants the original terms," Elias said. "The civil complaint stays active. The trust maintains its boundary position. The family arrangements, his phrase, are a private matter outside federal jurisdiction." He looked up. "He's betting on the circuit taking longer than 16 days and on Marsh not being found." She came in and sat down. "Is he right?" "About the circuit timeline, possibly. Federal proceedings are not fast, and Whitlock has enough connections to create procedural delays." He tapped the letter. "About Marsh." He stopped. A rider had arrived while they were speaking. They both heard the hooves on the drive at the same moment, and both went still in the way that people go still when they have been waiting for something and are now not certain they want it to have arrived. Mrs. Cobb knocked on the parlor door 30 seconds later. "A writer from Richmond," she said. "From a Mr. Price. He says it's for Mr. Worthington, and it's urgent." Elias was on his feet. The letter was shorter than he'd expected. Price wrote concisely when the news was significant. He had learned over years that important information needed no decoration. Elias read it standing, and Vivien watched his face, and she saw the exact moment when the words landed. He looked up. "Marsh is alive," he said. "He's in Lexington, Kentucky. He has been there since 1807. He owns a small farm." He paused. Price spoke to him. And her voice was careful. "He's been waiting," Elias said. "That's what Price writes, that he has been waiting for 8 years for someone from Virginia to come asking about his sister. That he accepted the land grant because he was afraid, and because he didn't know what else to do, and that he has not had one peaceful night in 8 years because of it." He looked at the letter. "He will testify. Price has a signed affidavit. He's sending it by the fastest rider available." The room was very quiet. Vivien pressed her hand flat against the table and breathed. 8 years, she said. "Yes." He waited 8 years for someone to ask. "Yes." She closed her eyes for a moment. Not long. Just the length of a breath that needed to go somewhere. Then she opened them and said, "When does the affidavit arrive?" 6 days. 7 at the outside. Before the circuit review. Before the circuit review, he confirmed. She looked at him across the table. "It's enough, isn't it? Marsh's affidavit combined with everything else. It's enough to take it to a criminal proceeding." He was quiet for a moment, honest as he always was about the limits of what he could promise. "It is enough to formally request a criminal inquiry. Whether a jury in Virginia in 1812 convicts a man of Whitlock's standing on the deaths of 2 wives." He stopped. "I cannot promise you that outcome. But the request goes on record," she said. "The affidavit goes on record. The pattern goes on record. Formally, federally, in a way that can never be unfiled." "Yes," he said. "All of that is certain." "Then it's enough," she said. "It may not be justice, but it's the end of the silence." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly what it is." The affidavit arrived on day 6. It arrived on the same morning that the county received the news through the invisible network, through the kitchen doors and the dry goods store, and the post office that Judge Horace Whitlock had without announcement or explanation departed Hargrove County. He had not left quietly. He had taken 2 wagons of household effects, 3 horses, and his 2 quiet men. He had gone south toward the Carolina border. He had not told anyone where he was going or when he intended to return. He had not left a forwarding address for his solicitor. He had simply gone. Vivien heard this at breakfast from Gerald, who had heard it from a man at the feed store, who had heard it from Whitlock's former stable hand, and she sat with it for a moment in the morning heat and tried to understand what she felt. Not triumph. She had been right about that 3 days ago. Triumph was too clean for this. What she felt was something more like the sensation of a long-held breath being released. Not celebration. Release. The specific physical relief of a weight that has been present so long you stopped noticing it as weight shifting off your chest. She went to find Elias. He was in the parlor reading the Marsh affidavit for the 3rd time, and he looked up when she came in and she said, "He's gone." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Where?" "South. No one knows exactly. The circuit review proceeds regardless," he said. "The affidavit is on record. The fraud documentation is on record. His physical location doesn't change the federal file." "I know." She came and sat down. "But the families in this county don't have to look at him anymore while it moves through the process. Clara Pettigrew can go back to the assembly circuit. The Pettigrew notes are under the administrative hold. The other families will all receive formal notification today," he said. that their notes are under administrative hold and cannot be collected against pending the investigation's conclusion. He paused. Gerald has offered to deliver the notifications personally. He knows all the families. She looked at the window. Gerald has surprised me. People tend to, Elias said, when the structure that was holding them in their worst behavior is removed. She thought about that. About structures. About the ones that had held her in place for 14 months, and the ones she was still daily learning to stop obeying out of habit, even now that they no longer had the force of necessity behind them. I have been thinking, she said, about what comes next. He set the affidavit down. Waited. His particular quality of waiting full attention, no prompting, no filling of silence with assumption. My father's accounts, she said. The original Boston merchant collapse. That debt has been absorbed into Gerald's situation, and Gerald's situation is better than it was now that the Whitlock notes are gone. But there is still the underlying question of what I do, where I am, what my life looks like when this is resolved. Yes, he said. I am 23 years old, she said. I have $40 in a boot. I have some knowledge of roses and household management and the social architecture of 2 Virginia counties, and apparently some aptitude for federal investigation support, though I suspect that last one is not widely remunerative. She looked at him with the directness that was entirely hers. What I do not have is a plan. What do you want? He asked. She held his gaze. I want to be useful, actually useful in a way that belongs to me. Not useful as an ornament or a social connector or a debt instrument. Useful in the way that... She paused. In the way that I have been this week, knowing things, asking the right people the right questions, understanding the texture of a situation and helping someone else move through it. He was quiet. You go to a different county after this, she said. It was not a question. I have 3 other survey assignments pending, he said. 1 in Maryland, 1 in Pennsylvania, 1 back in Western Virginia. And each of those counties has its own social architecture, she said. Its own networks of people who know things that documents don't contain. Its own Mrs. Cobbs and its own Fenwicks. He was very still. I am not asking you for anything, she said carefully. I want to be clear about that. I am not asking you to... She stopped, found the right shape of the sentence. I am making an observation about a professional gap and indicating that I have some qualifications relevant to filling it. The summer morning was very bright, and the parlor was warm, and outside a mockingbird was having strong opinions about something in the rose canes, and Elias Worthington looked at Vivian Hale across the table, where 4 days ago he had spread the documents of an 11-year fraud, and he understood with the clarity of a man who has spent 12 years learning to read situations accurately exactly what was happening in this room. He also understood that how he handled the next 60 seconds mattered considerably. A Federal Land Administration advisor, he said slowly, does not have an official position for a county intelligence resource. No, she agreed. What he has, he continued, is a professional associate. Someone with whom he corresponds. Someone whose knowledge of local social networks in specific counties he consults when entering a new administrative situation. She held his gaze. A professional associate, she said, would need to be compensated for her time and her expertise. Yes, he said, she would. Through legitimate channels, documented, not contingent on any personal arrangement. Entirely documented, he agreed. Entirely independent of any personal arrangement. The word personal sat in the room between them for exactly 1 moment. And the personal arrangement, she said quietly, if there were one, eventually, separately, would be separate, he said, entirely, and would be determined by the people involved at a pace determined by the people involved without any external pressure or internal obligation. He held her gaze steadily. I meant what I said to you in this room 3 nights ago. You owe me nothing. That has not changed. She breathed. I know, she said. And what I said to Whitlock at the gate, he said. That has not changed either. She was quiet for a moment. You are a very careful man, she said. I am, he agreed. I have also been on one specific occasion not careful enough. And I have spent 6 years understanding what that cost. She looked at him for a long time. At this man who had walked into a garden 4 days ago and heard her talking to a hedge and had not walked away. Who had told her the complicated truth when the simple version would have been easier. Who had threatened a powerful man on her behalf and then told her exactly why and let her decide what to do with the information. Who had in the space of 4 days conducted himself with a consistency that she had not before this week understood was possible in a person who also had his own interests in the situation. Elias, she said. Vivian, he said. I would like to write to you, she said. When you go to Maryland, professionally initially, about the social networks of the counties. I would like that very much, he said. And if the letters become, she paused, more than professional, over time. Then they become more than professional, he said, over time. And you'll come back through Virginia, she said, on the way to the Western assignment. Virginia is directly on the route, he said. She almost smiled, the complicated thing that was better than a simple smile. How convenient. I thought so, he said. He left on a Thursday morning 3 days later. The circuit review had been formally scheduled. The Marsh affidavit was on record. The administrative hold was in place across all 5 families. Gerald had delivered the notifications personally and had come back each evening looking slightly more like the man Vivien suspected he had been before fear and debt had made him smaller. Clara Pettigrew had gone home with her mother and her healing ankle and a future that was no longer being decided in rooms she wasn't invited into. Mrs. Cobb had been formally interviewed by the federal administrative officer as a material witness and had conducted herself with the precise, unshakable authority of a woman who had been waiting 8 years to say her piece in the right room. Whitlock had not returned to the county. His solicitor had withdrawn the civil complaint against Gerald on the grounds that the underlying financial instrument was under federal administrative review. He had not withdrawn it as a concession. He had withdrawn it as a tactical retreat, which was a different thing. And everyone who understood the situation understood the difference. But he was gone, and the women were still here. Elias said his farewells to Gerald in the study briefly, with the reserved courtesy of 2 men who had arrived at a functional respect through a complicated route and were both too understated to make a ceremony of it. He said goodbye to Mrs. Cobb in the kitchen, and she shook his hand with both of hers and said, "You did right by this household, Mr. Worthington," which was Vivien suspected the highest commendation the woman had given anyone in 19 years and possibly ever. He came to the garden last. Vivien was at the rose canes. She had been there since early morning, not because she needed to be, but because it was where she always went when she was working through something, and she was working through several things simultaneously. The garden was hers, in the way it had always been hers, without papers, without permission by the simple fact of attention and care. He came around the end of the hedgerow, the same hedge, the same corner of the garden where 4 days ago he had introduced himself to her in the summer heat and told her that the debt was gone. It felt like a long time ago. It felt like 4 days ago. Both things were true. "I'm leaving in an hour," he said. "I know." She did not stop what she was doing for a moment, her hands in the canes checking the new growth. The small, deliberate work of a person tending something that requires ongoing attention. Then she stopped and looked at him. Maryland. Maryland first, then Pennsylvania, and then back through Virginia. And then back through Virginia, he confirmed. She held his gaze. "Take care of yourself, Elias." "I generally do," he said. "No," she said. "I mean actually, not professionally careful. Actually." She looked at him with the directness that 4 days of complicated truth-telling had made between them. Not romantic, not yet, but something more durable than romance in its early forms. The directness of 2 people who have seen each other operate under pressure and have liked what they saw. "You have spent 12 years being professionally careful and personally still. I am asking you not to be still." He was quiet for a moment. "I wrote to her," he said. "Last night, to the woman in Charleston." She blinked. "What did you write?" "That I was sorry," he said. That I understood it was insufficient. That I had let fear of overstepping be an excuse for doing nothing, and that both of those things, the fear and the excuse, had cost her something she could not get back. He paused. And that I hoped she was well, and that she had people around her who saw her. Vivien was quiet. It was a short letter, he said. Sometimes short is right, she said. Yes. He held her gaze. She may not respond. She may not. And if she does, it may not be forgiveness. You weren't asking for forgiveness, Vivien said. You were asking for her to know that someone had stayed awake about it. Yes, he said. That's exactly what I was asking. The summer morning moved through the rose canes, and they stood in the same garden where this had all begun, and neither of them felt the need to make it larger than it was or smaller than it was, and that was itself a thing that Vivien recognized as rare and worth noting. Maryland, she said again. Maryland, he confirmed. Write to me when you've assessed the county situation, she said. I have some contacts in the Baltimore social network through my aunt's correspondence. There's a woman named Henderson who knows everyone in that circuit. I'll send you a letter of introduction. That would be useful, he said. Thank you. Professionally, she said, with the deliberate slight emphasis of a woman who is establishing a record. Professionally. He agreed with the deliberate slight warmth of a man who understands what is being established and approves of the precision. He settled his hat. Goodbye, Miss Hale. Goodbye, Mr. Worthington, she said. He turned and walked back through the garden gate and down the drive toward the horse that was waiting for him, and Vivien stood in the summer roses and watched him go, and did not look away, because she was done with the habit of not looking at things directly. She heard the horse move down the drive. She heard the sound of hooves on the lane beyond the gate. She heard it grow smaller in the morning heat, until the Virginia summer absorbed it entirely, and there was only the garden and the roses and the mockingbird and herself. She stood there for a while. Then she went inside, sat down at the small writing desk in the upstairs sitting room, and took out a piece of paper. She thought for a moment about what to write. Then she began. The first letter was professional. Entirely. It was 3 pages of precise, useful, carefully organized information about the social and financial networks of Baltimore County, as she understood them from 4 years of her aunt's correspondence with names and relationships, and the specific texture of which alliances held, and which were performative, and where the real information lived. It was, she thought, reading it back, genuinely good work. The kind of work that would be useful to someone navigating an unfamiliar county. The kind of work that had value independent of any personal consideration whatsoever. She signed it V. Hale. She sealed it. She addressed it to Elias Worthington, Federal Land Administration, Baltimore County, Maryland. Then she sat for a moment with the sealed letter in her hands and thought about what the next one might say. And the one after that. And what they might say over time, as Maryland gave way to Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania gave way to Western Virginia, and as Western Virginia brought a particular federal land administrator back through Hargrove County on what the route maps would describe as a logistical necessity, and what Vivian Hale would describe as a choice. She thought about choice, about the garden on a summer morning 4 days ago, when she had been counting down the days to September and Horace Whitlock. About the hedge and the voice she hadn't known she was using, and the man who hadn't known he was listening. About the $40 in the boot and the portfolio borrowed from Gerald's study, and the look on Clara Pettigrew's face when she had said, "You are safe. I promise you, you are safe," and meant it. About a woman in Charleston who was going to receive a letter this week that would not fix anything and might fix something, and who deserved to know that someone had stayed awake about it. About the difference, the precise, hard-won, irreplaceable difference between a life that was being decided for you in rooms you weren't invited into, and a life that you were building, one careful, deliberate, honest choice at a time in full daylight with your eyes open. She picked up the letter. She stood up. She walked downstairs and gave it to the morning rider, and she stood at the door and watched him go, and she breathed the August Virginia air into the bottom of her lungs. And Vivian Hale, who had stood in a garden 11 days ago and whispered that she was not a bargain and not a payment, who had learned in the space of 4 extraordinary days that the right person, hearing the right words at the right moment, could change the entire architecture of what was possible? Who had looked at a man who told her complicated truths and decided that complicated truths were exactly what she had been starving for all along? Vivian Hale straightened her back, turned away from the door, and walked into the life she had chosen. Not the life she had been handed, not the life she had survived, the one she was building. And she was just getting started.